is over. So the first portion is going to be about 45 minutes long, and Stacey Brown will be moderating. And then we're going to do a bit of an experiment where we do some breakout rooms in Zoom. So we'll have a chance to talk with each other. We could talk with complete strangers, or maybe even people that we know, a little bit like after a concert. And I think we should have some really interesting things to discuss together. So I'm going to get going. My name is Juliet Palmer. I'm the president of the Canadian New Music Network. I'm a composer and producer and do all sorts of work outside and inside. Outside seems preferable right now in this particular climate that we're in. So I'm talking to you from Toronto, which is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to people from across Turtle Island and around the world, including myself. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. The one dish, one spoon wampum is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people to peacefully and equitably share the resources of this region. And so all people who come to live on this land are welcome into this covenant, and we all live in the dish. And I think that's a really powerful image. I know many people have said we're all in this COVID-19 situation together, and we are in it together, but we're not necessarily in the same way. With the same, many of us have privileges that others don't. And part of this conversation is figuring out where we're at, how we can support each other, how we can nurture each other's creativity, and how we can imagine a different future together. So on that note, I'm just going to hand it over to Ian.
Hi.
Crutchley. Yeah.
Ian Crutchley, and I'm talking to you from Mount Crutchley, which is known to some as Edmonton. And I'm in Treaty 6 territory, and I'm very, very happy and very honored to be speaking from here in a situation of sharing and talking to creative people. I'm representing myself, but also the Canadian League of Composers, and we are very happy to be collaborating with the Canadian New Music Network on at least some of this series of talks. And I will then turn it over to Stacy.
Hi, so I'm Stacy Brown, and I am joining you today from Kamloops, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc Nation. Usually I'd be in Montreal, but I've been on my lockdown in Kamloops right now. And I'm a composer. I've actually been a board member on both the Canadian New Music Network and the Canadian League of Composers. And I'm really happy to be participating in this conversation today. And thrilled to be hearing the thoughts of our four distinguished guests on the panel. And so I'm going to start out, I'll just kind of let you know where we're going with this. So I'm going to start out by asking each of the guests to introduce themselves, just a short introduction, and each of them has sent us a little clip of some of their work. So we'll play that clip following each introduction, and then we will get started with the conversation. So do we have a volunteer on our panel who'd like to start off the introductions? All right, Keiko.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Keiko Devaux. I am primarily a composer, teacher, student. I am the current president of the conseil administratif au cours d'accès. I've lived in many places in Canada, East, West Coast, currently in Montreal, and yeah, and currently not totally in lockdown, but in isolation, composing here in my little home residence in Montreal.
Thanks.
Oh, and you want me to choose a piece? If I remember correctly, the piece that I sent to, I sent a piece titled Dust, which is a string quartet I wrote just last summer for the Quartetto Prometeo in Italy. And they performed it in Siena. And it's a piece about memory and nostalgia and sort of skeletons of sound.
Okay, I'm going to try to play it. Just a moment. Let's see how this will work.
Thanks so much, Keiko.
Thanks, Cheryl.
So yeah, I guess we so do we have anyone who'd like to volunteer to go next around the circle of our guests to give a little introduction and set up the clip that you've sent us? Terrific. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, yeah. I'm Andrew Reed Miller, originally from the United States, although most of my friends don't know that. I lived in Ottawa and Toronto, and right now I live in St. John, New Brunswick, and I've been here for over 20 years. And I'm mostly a performer, and then after that, I'd say I'm an sort of organizer, administrator, artistic director type person. And then I also do a bit of composing. And in my performing, I have a bit of black note type stuff, and then I have a bit of improvising type stuff over the years. And in terms of the, well, one thing I wanted to say that's very interesting about our situation around here is for 14 days, we had not a single case of COVID-19 here. So, and then there was one confirmed yesterday. So things are a lot more kind of loose here after a period of pretty heavy duty quarantine. Anyway, the piece that there's a little clip of, it's something I composed, but it has an improvisational element. It's one of a series of pieces I call Circles. And I don't remember how long this clip is, but basically you have a bunch of instruments doing some stuff. And then gradually there's a max patch that takes over and begins making things sound like Alvin the Chipmunk or something.
All right.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. All right, we've got two panelists left to introduce themselves. Do we have a volunteer for second to last? All right, excellent. We've got Andrew. Go ahead. All right, Curtis. Sorry, Curtis. Go ahead.
Was it my hand that went up first? I wasn't sure if it was.
Oh, it was, you know, with the way that the screens work, I'm never totally sure, but I think I saw yours first, so go ahead.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, nestor na goka sa stomach na morto to sixigase tapi anik na morto to mokinsis. Hello, my name is Curtis Running Rabbit Left Hand. I come from the Siksika people here in the Treaty 7 area, or also known as the Blackfoot Confederacy. Specifically, I come from the Amskapi Piikani Nation in the Siksika Nation, and I'm also part Stoney Nakoda from this area in this area Treaty 7. And I'm the executive artistic director for an organization, an Indigenous-led organization called Indigenous Resilience in Music. And I am also, I guess I'm a composer. I usually just like call myself a musician. I do a little bit of work with mainly just guitar and synthesizers and modulators and all that stuff, and I guess composing it into just a landscape of sound. And yeah, and I also play in a number of bands and stuff, so I do a number of things in the music community. But the piece I sent over to Terry is a piece I put together. I don't know if it's 30 seconds, but it's actually just a segment of a documentary I was featured in. And I also composed the guitar work behind in the background. Yeah, and this documentary is called Voices on the Rise.
For urban Indigenous people, it can be a challenge to maintain our cultural identities while living in cities dominated by the English language. I'm meeting with artist, musician, and scholar Curtis Left Hand to learn how he navigates this tension as a fluent Blackfoot speaker.
It's funny because I feel like a lot of people back home find like definitely some of a disconnect between a city Indian, like someone who's urban Indigenous, and then someone who like comes from that community or lives in that community. And it's like, isn't it interesting?
Great. Thanks so much. And Ilana.
Hi, my name is Ilana, and I'm a violinist from, basically from Toronto, but I grew up in the suburbs in Mississauga. Currently, I'm out in San Diego, in La Jolla specifically, which is unceded territory of the Kumeyaay peoples. And at the moment, I'm doing my doctorate at UCSD in contemporary performance. So I have primarily, I don't know, at the moment I'm a performer also trying to be a scholar, but I also work as an arts administrator as well. I'm one of the co-artistic directors along with Cheryl Duval of the Nedge New Music Collective, which is a Toronto-based ensemble. We're just, in September, we'll be starting our 10th season, so that's a huge thing for us. Yeah, I'm also working on trying to transition into being somebody that's making things more and not just like producing, presenting, or performing other people's music exclusively. So I'm kind of working on exploring more improvisation and visual arts and various things. I don't really know where that's taking me at the moment, but that's kind of why I'm back in school. So the clip that I'm going to show, or that you guys are going to show, is a small snippet of a piece by Toronto-based composer Julia Mermelstein, along with some of these new projects I'm trying to develop. I've started this ongoing concert collaborative project thing called Filaments. And the first iteration was where I worked with 5 different composers to create new works for kind of violin and something, either multimedia or like just something else besides music, because I've been finding that I'm more and more interested in like what that means, and I really love how it pushes me into new areas as a performer and just makes you think about things in new ways. So this is a snippet of her piece called Inner Forms for Violin, Electronics, and Movement. And basically it explores relationships within oneself, sort of the facades we try to uphold, and how this, exploring different aspects of vulnerability in this context.
Great, thank you. So that's introductions then by all of our distinguished guests on the panel today, presenting a little bit of their work to give us some context. What we're going to do, I know there's been people joining as we've gone through this, is that we're going to have a conversation amongst the panelists that takes two basic questions or basic areas and asks each of the panelists to sort of expand their ideas on these two areas. Once we've completed the panel portion of this, we're going to move into some breakout rooms if you're interested, and when that time comes, I'm going to ask Juliet to explain a little bit how that works again before we move into the breakout rooms. So to get us started, I'm going to pose a very broad question for our panelists, and let whoever feels inspired to jump in and get our conversation started. So the question is, what are the healthy and sustaining practices that you have found or experienced, both individually and for your community or your organization? That obviously relates to the situation that we're in right now. A lot of practices have had to change based on restrictions around COVID. And we're all thinking about ways that we can continue our practice and continue some level of connection and community. So if you have any sort of, I guess I'll just leave it there and see if anybody wants to jump in. Healthy or sustaining practices that you've found or experienced or witnessed. Maybe you're still working towards those yourselves. Does anybody want to start us off? This is a very practical sort of thing. We could be looking at what you do on a single day to connect with music in some way. What you're thinking about right now in terms of your practice. It could be a very practical step. It could be listening. What are you listening to right now? Are you playing your instrument more than you did before? There's a lot of different areas that that this could relate to. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Keiko. Oh, you are muted right now. I'm not hearing you.
Sorry. I'll respond on a personal level because it's sort of my reaction to this whole situation was very, obviously, for me, personal at first, and now it's slowly sort of seeping out, and I'm starting to think less about just myself and more about what's going on around me. But immediately, I would say I had to get a lot more into a routine in terms of, I'm speaking, I suppose, as a composer. I know there's all these memes and jokes going around about how composers, this is what a composer looks like, and this is what a composer looks like during quarantine, and it's like nothing changes. But I actually find it very challenging. I find it very difficult. Like, I spend a lot of time at home by myself working, but somehow those small little impromptu exchanges with neighbors and people at the store and a student after class and just these in-person interactions, I realized how important they were, like how vitally important they were for me to feel human and to be able to go home and then kind of go into myself and work on something. And I found myself very frozen at the beginning. So on a personal level, I've been developing much more, I don't want to say stricter, but routine has become a lot more important to me, but also sort of trying to create a little bit of lovely chaos in the routine. So calling people randomly has been very important to me. So having sort of impromptu conversations with people that I wouldn't necessarily call ever these days, and not a scheduled call. It's really, really important. And meditating twice a day has become vital, just kind of sitting and sort of getting back into the moment, because I'm finding a lot of time in front of the screen and not going outside as much and not being around other people. I've lost, I really stopped being sort of in the present. And walking. I mean, walking has always been a very traditional thing that creators do to think and process, but now more than ever, I would say, like just kind of walking in any direction for like a half an hour to an hour every day has become extremely helpful. And like, I need it to just kind of ground myself and have something that marks the beginning, the middle, or the end of the day. So yeah, that's my personal response to it. I don't know. I'm not even talking about Zoom and platforms. I'm just speaking right away, just as a human. That's how I've reacted.
Yeah, well, I can understand that. There's, in order to be able to lock into that inner space, you hope that there'll be some balance with something happening externally, right? So I guess when everything starts to feel very internal, it gets difficult to find that balance between the two. Yeah. Does anyone else want to speak to that experience of creation? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, like the way my life generally is ordered in a period of a couple of months, I go through different phases, normally, whatever that means, but in the olden times, so I would be rehearsing and performing a whole lot for a week or two. Then I might be teaching for a bit, and then I might go into a period that actually resembles something like what we're in now, but it might only last for, 4 or 5 days or something like that. So my life usually has this flow to it, and this business that's happened recently has kind of erased the whole flow. Like every day is the same in a way. So I like what Keiko said about having to try and create some artificial ebbs and flows. Normally I don't have to think about taking a day and just do nothing, because I've done a whole lot of things, and then I have to do nothing for a while, and then because something else is coming up next week or whatever. Now it's like I have to say, okay, today's my day off. And the other thing about this thing that I've noticed is it's like the different stages of grief. So, you have denial and acceptance and all this kind of thing. So when it first happened, I was like, oh boys, I'm going to sit down and I've got this thing I have to write that's going to be in October, And I was really gung-ho. And then, of course, the nullifyingly kind of boring, nothing came along to change it. And it was like, well, normally my life gets interrupted by something else that happens, in my professional sort of schedule. Yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that too. There's when there's no interruptions, how do you create breaks?
Yeah.
Right? It becomes maybe a less organic process. Have you, Ilana or Curtis, found ways to break up your days? And do you want to speak to this a little bit?
Sure. I guess I have a different situation right now because UC San Diego is on a quarter system. So we're actually in the 5th week of our spring session, and it just started actually when everything shut down. So we had like 1 week to transition to online teaching and online learning, and that was really very strange at first, definitely, especially for like some of the classes that I'm a TA for are very large, and they're not necessarily with like music students. And I think just finding ways to like connect with people, and some people went home far away and they're like watching asynchronously, and like how do you connect, and how can you like make it feel like a real thing where you're learning and exchanging. And so that's been kind of really there were some really scary moments at first, but it's coming along. So that's been an interesting learning curve. It's also been a bit strange because my days are kind of very full at the moment. I have this like structure imposed on me, and I know that that's very fortunate because I'm also, able to work through school. That's part of what is happening, at least until July. So I think what's going to happen when the summer hits is that I'm going to go through what some people were going through like now, and I'm going to go through those stages of just trying to figure out how to restructure life and what that means. One thing that has been a little strange is like I'm in a residence at the moment, and I can't really practice in the same way. I love to practice at night, and I can't do that here. And there's a space that I can use for a little bit, but it's kind of in an uncomfortable area where a lot of people are passing by. And so I've been kind of like trying to figure out how to just get used to play there and make the kind of music that I make in a space that's public sort of. So, but I think, yeah, what Keiko's saying about like going for walks, I've been finding that's been a huge help for me. And actually some of the classes I'm taking right now, and like, because I can't play as much, I've been taking in other things, and I find I've been drawing a lot of like inspiration from learning about different kinds of visual arts practices, and somehow that's been really inspiring me, just like being aware of people's creativity in new ways that I'm not as familiar with. That's been like a big help to just keep feeling inspired and like really amazed at like what humanity can do and create. So I think that's been a huge help for me. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's definitely a thread happening here in terms of that idea of community and connection. Curtis, do you have something to add to that in terms of your experience of healthy or sustaining practices that you're able to get to right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting for me just because in here in Treaty 7, like my organization, we had a bunch of programs that were going to be happening actually right now. We had an artist residency program that was going to be kicking off, and then we had youth programs on different reservations in the area that were going to be happening from June through July. And then we had a music festival, and we canceled all of those as the public components. So there's just like a lot of stuff around that where, that's like the bulk of our programming. And so it keeps us busy. And so for myself, it's interesting. I guess I didn't mention it in my intros. I'm also a festival manager for another festival here in the city called the Leurs Hardcore Festival. And all of those were canceled, and all the programming we had just kind of like put at a standstill. And then there was just like a lot of, it went from being busy for 2 weeks of just trying to navigate what happens next, and then going into, and then getting busy again now. Now we're like super busy again, where it's like there is the virtual online realm that we can tap into to activate our programs as we have them. But for myself, it's been individually, it's been interesting because like looking into how I interact with within the music industry or in the music community, and as a composer or as a musician and as an artist, you know, going from being so super busy, I was working on a documentary that I was going to be composing the music for, the documentary that I was producing and directing. That was obviously had to be put at a standstill. And so all this stuff just kind of just like boiled down to, okay, well, I have nothing to do right now. And within that, it kind of put me into a space where, you know, there was just a lot of having to face a lot of trauma and a lot of, you know, just like a lot of things that that I never really fully faced in the past, and go tapping into that was more of like, okay, well, how do I sustain myself in that? And it's really come down to like, you know, my basic practices as a Blackfoot person, and my spirituality with, you know, being able to smudge every day, wake up, smudge, have a morning prayer, and then going to make an offering with tobacco, and all of these different spiritual practices that are part of who I am as a Blackfoot man and a Sitapi man, and how that's and that really changes my day, where I know like I'm in isolation. I know like I'm gonna have to work, and I'm working now, but that bit of time in the morning to do that really changes the day's plans and the day's agenda. And I think for me, that's really gotten me through a lot of it. And then also music has really, I'm not able to practice music right now. I'm not able to like practice my guitar because the place that I live in. So it's hard. The same situation with you, Alana. Like I can't really, you know, tap into how I would usually be creating and whatnot, because I don't have that opportunity to do that right now. So it's just like super interesting. So it's gotten to actually where it's actually gotten to a lot of visual art stuff, and getting back into different art practices that are not necessarily related to music. And yeah, and then just like the breaks I have is going out onto the land, like literally just like taking a drive out, going to my reserve, and even making offerings and smudging out there, and just taking that time to take in this time of like, you know, my restorative, sustainable practice of healing, and navigating also, because I'm still learning that too, in a different situation now, obviously with COVID-19, just like how do I get better at healing, and those practices have helped me get to in this time to where I am right now, like having to face these things and face them head on, and now being busy again and being busy with work again for hopefully for the foreseeable future to last. Yeah.
I'm sort of interested in hearing all of you talk in how where you're drawing your energy. I know that, you know, the flow of energy when you're working, when you're creating. You've talked a little bit about being, you know, outdoors, or being in interaction with others, playing music with others. So I'm sort of curious on that same sort of sustaining and positive practices, how you're finding your energy flow and where you're drawing that energy right now, while you're not in as close contact with your musical community.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's been a very difficult time not being busy. I've realized how much of a social person I am. I used to think of myself as kind of a hermit, but I'm not at all. You know, like just the act of playing music with people in the same room, even you might not really say 10 words, you know, or you might say a lot of words, but you could conceivably say very few things, but there's this exchange of energy that happens, and it's kind of it's not there anymore. And it was very, it still is very hard for me to not do that. So all I can say is it's very difficult to find energy.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a secret tip for us where they're drawing their energy right now? Curtis.
Eat good food. One of the things that for me, again, personally, this is actually something before this, this year I was starting is getting back to my ancestral eating practices. So that's like, you know, like a black person's diet of how we would eat way back in the day, and adapting that to modern times. and through that practice, because it's like, you know, it's again, it's like a spiritual happening, because you also have to like harvest your own food. You have to, now I'm looking at building my own I guess garden, but building a garden box so I can like grow my own, harvest my own vegetables and whatnot. And then now looking at what it's like, because for a while I was I've been vegetarian for a long time, which is really interesting for an Indigenous person or a Blackfoot person to be vegetarian. I'm usually called a bad hunter. But through that, and I know that kind of taps into like, you know, having the physical energy, but I think like that change in just like what I've been doing with like, even with music, like how like the ideas I have, even though I can't practice it right now, the ideas I have for projects coming up that I'm wanting to work on once I can get access to create and continue writing music. I have like, there's so many ideas that are like flowing through. But then again, work has gotten busy for me too now. So it's like that is continuing on, and now it's like busy work. So kind of almost business as usual online and virtually. But I feel like those steps that I'm making in that, and those different changes that I'm making towards, you know, my better health, it also obviously impacts your mental health as well. And so it even helps in my mental health with how I'm interacting socially with people online, or just with the folks that are around me that I can connect with, or that if I'm able to or have to connect with at certain times, and really just like changes that, and also, yeah, just and trying to be as active as possible. That's the other, physically active. Yeah.
That actually segues a little bit. I'm going to ask Alana and Keiko to jump in on this next idea, because I said we wanted to sort of do a bit of a two-part and talk about some practical things that are happening right now, but hearing, you know, conversation about things happening online more, and knowing that that's the case for all of us. I mean, this is a case in point. What kinds of directions or visions would you like to move towards in the future? And I guess I'm leading off of that online space because that's something we're all experiencing right now. But I guess what I'm asking is really sort of, how do you imagine us moving beyond the situation we're in, and where do you think we could be, and what would you like to see? Those are not small questions, but they're broad. Does somebody want to jump in, Keiko or Alana, there with a first thought on that? Oh, I think you're both muted right now.
I'll just say small. I don't have like
there we go. I can hear Keiko.
I don't have like a huge response to that, but I really miss sort of the feeling of gathering, which is, I guess, what we're doing right now. And I'm curious to hear about other people's ideas and ways that, if this is the situation that is going to be sustained for a period or coming back in waves, a way to kind of to feel like you're present in a group in a safe way would be important to me. There's been a lot of activity of people remaining present and visible online and being active, and a lot of people trying to normalize what's going on and just transplant what they're doing, but now online. And I think it's a lot of very normal and understandable sort of reactive behavior, because it's very unprecedented what's going on. And so we're all just trying to survive and take care of ourselves and take care of our loved ones. But, you know, so we haven't, I mean, personally, I haven't had a lot of time to really think about the future. And it's quite difficult to think about the future when we're not really given a lot of definitive statements about the future. And I think, in terms of sort of music and cultural experiences, if I want to be more specific, I would like to speak about more and discuss with other people ways that we can create a sense of event. I don't mean like fancy, I just mean where we arrive and we all meet and we discuss and we talk, and then there's something that starts and that ends, and then we can stay and remain and exchange ideas and exchange energy and niceties, because a lot of what I've found has been missing in the things that I have, you know, attended in the last recent bit is that exchange. There's a lot of, you know, a person, you know, to an audience, and the audience is not often not visible. And for me, I really, really miss the audience experience, that shared audience experience, which is a lot harder to recreate currently with the constraints that we have. So I don't have an answer, obviously. It's just, but that's the thing that I focus on a lot, thinking about, you know, potential future shows that I might be involved in or organize, or potential ideas for Codex and just different ways that we can make the public feel more integrated and more present and in the moment. And like, how do you make the public feel valued, that they're there by like a number that goes up in the bottom left-hand screen, that there's more people watching by, like, I feel like there obviously are better ways to express our presence and our love of something. So just kind of trying to brainstorm and think about that for me, and I think for a lot of people, that's really what's missing a lot, and not just music performances, but any kind of online exchange. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, this has really made me think about most of the things I'm involved in are relatively small scale performances. You know, in terms of the new music stuff, it's, you know, fairly small numbers. And but even larger concerts that I do, you know, orchestra stuff or whatever, there's still the sense that there's an exchange. So we're giving to the audience, and the audience gives back, whether it's after the concert, like Keiko was saying, and talking about it, or even just you look and you see the audience, as there's an exchange. And I find with this medium, like if you look at these, you know, online concerts or whatever, it's very much one way, you know, and it's not really a terribly good one way either. It's just one way, and then there's no feedback.
Alana, I feel like you could probably speak to that.
Yeah, these are all things that I guess partly myself and Cheryl as co-ADs for Thin Edge have been spending the past however long we've been in this situation now, 6 weeks, is that right? Something like that. Trying to figure out what this means for like on several levels, like presenting things. We were just about to have a concert in March, like right before this happened, and I didn't go back, and of course we weren't able to do it, and we all have these stories of so many things. We're just trying to figure out like what this means for our upcoming season, and also, but yeah, like having also taken in different kinds of online platforms and things, like it is really hard, you know, not to have it feel like a one-way, I don't know, form of communication. And because like as a performer myself, the exchange of energy, not only as like myself, but with other people, like your fellow musicians and the audience, is like, that's what's so special about a live performance. And it's just so hard to know what's gonna, you know, happen with how, like whether this is gonna be in waves, whether we're gonna have to, I think it's gonna take time to figure out really what that means. From like the organizational standpoint too, we have is a set of like our Thin Edge family, like our, you know, fellow performers that we've been working with, and trying to figure out like what can we do with them to sort of make these connections happen over the next year. That's something we're kind of also brainstorming, like how can we do things that are sort of maybe more meaningful or personal in different ways. And I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation. So I'm kind of curious to hear more about what other people are thinking too at this time. Yeah.
Well, and Curtis, you were actually mentioning that a lot of things had been happening online for you. So unless if I'm remembering correctly, do you have any sort of visions for the future in terms of where things could go for you or for your organization, where we could find ourselves post lockdown, I suppose would be the best way to put it.
Yeah, like although we have like a lot going on online now, that there is like, it is kind of hard because speaking to what everyone was saying is it's really difficult because, you know, I also come from a people that really need that connection with other people in person, and to talk in person, and to even talk about music or even sing our traditional songs together. It's important to have the person like sitting next to you or sitting across from you. Like that's like a huge way of our living, and especially spiritually and everything too. And it's really hard because, you know, moving from that into an online component where we're going to have an elder come in and run a program talking about traditional songs and stuff like that for our youth programs. It's and that's specifically for our youth programming. It's kind of hard to really feel like it's real, like feel like it's an actual like spiritual happening kind of thing. Because, you know, when an elder speaks, the majority of the time it's usually like a spiritual happening, especially when they're talking about music, because music is very much a spiritual guide for us in our culture, and for many other Indigenous cultures out there too. But yeah, I think with us adapting to the times, like, you know, we don't see this as like these programs where we're creating them because we have to, and we know that a lot of these youth, a lot of these musicians need these platforms, as far as having online performances, and having youth programs where youth can be put in training sessions or sessions that teach them various different music components, and just a lot of that stuff. So like, you know, we don't want it to last, but right now we're able to work with what we have. You know, still like we have a bit of time until our programs launch or relaunch again as a virtual online component, and we're with virtual online components. And I don't want this to be the future. Like, I don't want this to be how it continues on, because, you know, being unable to be again in those interactions, those social connections physically, that really puts a big barrier. And I think for us is that, you know, with the future, it's like we're adapting, but and there are definitely programs that you can use out there, online programs that, you know, you can still connect, but it's not true. I will admit that it's not fully true connection, as it would be in person. And that's just for me being, you know, very realistic about my own upbringing in music, and my own experiences in music as it relates to my culture. And I don't, you know, like personally, like the future, I don't think will, obviously and I'm hoping and praying it doesn't stay online, but if it lasts, like, you know, last 2 years or something like that, I think there's ways we can adapt, but we just also have to kind of bite down into the struggle that this is a struggle, and those physical inabilities or those opportunities to be physically like close to each other in a performance, or being able to see a crowd in a performance is just, you know, might not happen. So and this is something that brings up in my mind, is like, so I have my own coping mechanisms, but also like, what are people's coping mechanisms? Because what you're talking about, Andrew, is like, you know, it's the stages of grief. Like, these are like, you know, we are put in situations where we have to face these realities. Like, you know, we're not going to have those physical connections in person, and trade off those energies that come with that. And so how do we cope with that? And although I have my own practices, but I'm interested also to hear like what other people's ideas are towards that, if they even know, or if they're still navigating.
So I think that's actually a great spot to pause, because the next step of this conversation is actually going to be moving into some breakout rooms to actually allow people who have been sitting and listening to this conversation so far to have a chance to participate in a smaller setting. And just before we do that, I would like to just go once around. And you're talking about coping mechanism. So this is a 10 seconds or less response of something that you are doing right now in your practice that is your coping mechanism or your way of finding a positive space for your creative work. And maybe we'll start with Curtis, since you mentioned the coping mechanism. You get to go first.
10 seconds, you said?
Sure.
Is it okay if we just like name it? And
Absolutely.
yeah, cool. Prayer, smudge, for myself, singing traditional songs, speaking with my elders online, and speaking with my mom, and continuing to remember my language through speaking it with my elders.
Fantastic. Alana?
Sorry. I think collaboration, family, quiet time, being outside, not in front of a screen. And yeah, I mean, even connecting with people over a screen is also kind of still special, because that's like what we can do at this point. So I feel connection maybe is in whatever way it can be.
Great. Andrew?
Two things. One is I agree, be outdoors. I'm a big fan of that, and it's fortunate this is happening in the springtime, although I go for walks when it's -30. The second thing is I'm using it as an opportunity to kind of relearn how to do some things. Just, I've got time now, so I'm pretending to, be a child and a beginner and just relearn how to do some things.
Excellent. Keiko?
I would echo a lot what everyone's saying, being outside, gardening, doing everything, but I would kind of lump them all together, and I would say doing the basic things that I've always done, like make food, make coffee, and garden, and then just do them all from scratch. So making them more complicated for myself, but it kind of holds the attention and keeps you in the moment.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn it over to Juliet so she can sort of explain how the breakout rooms are going to work. And thanks for your contribution so far, everyone.
Wow, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stacey. Thanks, Andrew, Ilana, Curtis, and Keiko. I really appreciate your openness and your willingness just to be vulnerable with us, because this is such a weird medium, and we're talking about things that are actually pretty personal. Creativity is like at the heart of who we are. So I'm really excited we're going to try this. We haven't done this before in this particular context, but what's going to happen is Terry, who is behind the scenes, who's invisible logo person that makes things happen. Terry is the executive director of CNMN. Anyway, she will click a button and send us into these magical breakup spaces. And we're going to do 6 rooms with 4 people in them each. And in that breakout room, you'll be in there for five minutes or so. We've got 4 questions that the panelists have offered us, and they're actually in the chat box. If you've seen that on the side, if you don't see it, look on the bottom bar or somewhere on your interface. There'll be a little speech bubble. Click on that, and you'll see those 4 questions there. So you don't have to tackle all 4 questions, just one that really speaks to you. So I'm just going to read them quickly through. How do our healing practices or abilities to cope through struggles continue after this pandemic for musicians and creatives? Second one is, how do we move past reactive action adaptation towards more long-term and sustainable planning when the manner of the crisis we're dealing with is so unpredictable and variable? Third one, how do you find yourself responding to the trend to actively produce and share work, develop a new skill set, or reinvent your practice during this time of self-quarantine? I already feel stressed reading that one. And then lastly, very simple, what are your thoughts online versus live in person? So those are 4 questions. And in your little group of 4, and the panelists, you can choose to join a group if you want, or you can just stay out in your little virtual land, wherever you are. But at the end of that time, you'll get a little signal saying we're going to come back to the main group. And I just say that during your conversation, just choose one person amongst you who's kind of keeping track of what's being spoken, because when you come back, I just invite you to just very briefly share, I'd say 20 seconds, sharing something from that conversation that you've had.